Hello, I'm Willie from the Ozarks, and I'm so glad you've come to join me to study Lesson 16 in A Course in Miracles Workbook for Students. Here on January the 16th of 2023, I have no neutral thoughts. I have no neutral thoughts. The idea for today is a beginning step in dispelling the belief that your thoughts have no effect. Everything you see is the result of your thoughts. There is no exception to this fact. Thoughts are not big or little, powerful or weak. They are merely true or false. Those which are true create their own likeness. Those which are false make theirs. There is no more self-contradictory concept than that of idle thoughts. What gives rise to the perception of the whole world can hardly be called idle. Every thought you have contributes to truth or to illusion. Either it extends the truth or it multiplies illusions. You can indeed multiply nothing, but you will not extend it by doing so. In addition to never being idle, salvation requires that you recognize that every thought you have brings peace or war, either love or fear. A neutral result is impossible because a neutral thought is impossible. Wow, each thought is either born at the deeper level from fear or love. A neutral result is impossible because a neutral thought is impossible. There is such a temptation to dismiss fear thoughts as unimportant, trivial, and not worth bothering about, that it is essential you recognize them all as equally destructive, but equally unreal. Maybe destructive, but they're unreal. Remember, we're dreaming, and in the dream you can have a destructive thought, but that doesn't make it real. We will practice this idea in many forms before you really understand it. So don't be too bothered if you're not getting it all real clear. Just keep studying and reading and looking at it. It'll become clearer and clearer depending on how much effort you put out at trying to understand, of course. In applying the idea for today, search your mind for a minute or so with eyes closed and actively seek not to overlook any little, and that's in quotes, little thought which tends to elude the search. This is quite difficult until you get used to it. You will find that it is still hard for you not to make artificial distinctions. Every thought that occurs to you, regardless of the quality which you assign to it, is a suitable subject for applying today's idea. In the practice periods, first repeat the idea, and then as each one crosses your mind, hold it in awareness while you tell yourself, this thought about blank is not a neutral thought, and that thought about blank is not a neutral thought. As usual, use today's idea whenever you are aware of a particular thought which arouses uneasiness. The following form is suggested for this purpose. This thought about blank is not a neutral thought because I have no neutral thoughts. 4 or 5 practice periods are recommended if you find them relatively effortless. If strain is experienced, 3 will be enough. The length of the exercise period should also be reduced if there is discomfort. So we don't want there to be any discomfort. We want to find this quiet going inside to be a time of freedom and release and upliftment, not coercion and forced. And if there's any fear at all, well, let's go easy and slow. Let's let you see that there is no reason to be afraid of going within. All right? The main thing I have to say about this is think about it, that there's no idle thought. You can put your car in idle, but you can't put yourself in idle. You're not in neutral. You can't ever be in neutral. You're either engaged. You're either engaged in creation and extending the way God created you and creating in His image, or you're miscreating and multiplying illusions, as He calls it. So, but each thought is doing one or the other. So we want to get down to the unwatched mind and begin to see which one we're doing and begin to focus on what's good. Okay? On the holy, on the atonement, forgiveness. Okay, let's go take a look in our text reading And we're ready for we're in chapter 2, the illusion of separation, and we're ready for starting section 6, the last section in chapter 2, the meaning of the last judgment. And we'll read that section, and we'll start here in just a minute. While you're turning there, if you want to hear about another real highly resistant apple, it's the Stayman Winesap apple, and this is from Edible Landscaping. Stayman Winesap tree can flourish without care. Examples of older trees in our area that are uncared for still produce usable fruit. Usually they go into alternate bearing and produce heavy crops every other year when not cared for. Trees are resistant like Arkansas black apple. So they resist that big problem we have around here is that cedar apple rust. So it's resistant to that. So that's nice. The fruit can be very large. They ripen early fall and can soften quickly at room temperature, but will keep in the refrigerator for about 6 weeks. Flavor is tart-mild with a crisp texture and very good eating. Excellent taste for juicing and cider blends. It is a favorite roadside market apple in Virginia. Developed in 1866 from Leavenworth, Kansas. Stayman does not pollinate other apples, so it is a good trio tree with 2 different varieties planted nearby. Zones 5 through 8, 800 chill hours required. Zones 5 through 8. Okay. All right, now let's take a look. And rather than starting at the meaning of the last judgment, let's back up and read the last paragraph of the section we read yesterday. One of the chief ways in which man can correct his magic miracle confusion is to remember that he did not create himself. He is apt to forget this when he becomes egocentric, and this places him in a position where the belief in magic in some form is virtually inevitable. His will to create was given him by his own Creator, who was expressing the same will in his creation. Since creative ability rests in the mind, everything that man creates is necessarily a matter of will. It also follows that whatever he creates is real in his own sight, but not necessarily in the sight of God. This basic distinction leads us directly into the real meaning of the last judgment. Okay, so let's go on. Section 6, the meaning of the last judgment. The last judgment is one of the greatest threat concepts in man's perception. This is only because he does not understand it. Judgment is not an essential attribute of God. Man brought judgment into being only because of the separation. After the separation, however, there was a place for judgment as one of the many learning devices which had to be built into the overall plan. Just as the separation occurred over many millions of years, the last judgment will extend over a similarly long period, and perhaps an even longer one. Its length depends, however, on the effectiveness of the present speed up. Wow. The effectiveness of the present speed up. Paragraph 107. We frequently noted that the miracle is a device for shortening but not abolishing time. If a sufficient number of people become truly miracle-minded quickly, the shortening process can be almost immeasurable. Now, y'all heard about the 100th monkey principle. Anyway, he's saying here that it's kind of a similar idea. So if a sufficient number of people become truly miracle-minded quickly, the shortening process can be almost immeasurable. It is essential, however, that these individuals free themselves from fear sooner than would ordinarily be the case, because they must emerge from the conflict if they are to bring peace to other minds. So in natural evolution, you're going to eventually recognize that it's better to go through the door than walk through and keep hitting against the wall. So, you'll finally get it. But he's saying we can speed it up and collapse time by the practice of miracle-mindedness. Paragraph 108, and speeds things up, okay? The last judgment is generally thought of as a procedure undertaken by God. Actually, it will be undertaken by man with my help. It is a final healing rather than a meting out of punishment. The last judgment is a final healing rather than a meting out of punishment, however much man may think that punishment is deserved. Punishment is a concept in total opposition to right-mindedness. The aim of the last judgment is to restore right-mindedness to man. 109. The last judgment might be called a process of right evaluation. It simply means that finally all men will come to understand what is worthy and what is not. After this, their ability to choose can be directed reasonably. Let's look at that again. The last judgment might be called a process of right evaluation. It simply means that finally all men will come to understand what is worthy and what is not. After this, their ability to choose can be directed reasonably. Until this distinction is made, however, the vacillation between free and imprisoned will cannot but continue. This is a process of division only in the constructive sense and reflects the true meaning of the apocalypse. This is a process of division only in the constructive sense and reflects the true meaning of the apocalypse. Man will ultimately look upon his own creations and will to preserve only what is good, just as God himself looked upon what he had created and knew that it was good. Remember that when God created something and he says, there in Genesis, first he created day 1, day 2, 3, and he looked at it and he said it is good. Well, we want to get to the place where we look at our creations and say they are good because they're just an extension of God. It reminds me of Philippians 4:8, which happened to be what I considered to be my wife Diane before she crossed over. Her lifetime verse was Philippians 4, I think it was 7 and 8, but 8, it has the idea in it, whatsoever is good, think of these things. We're not going to go look at it for the sake of time, but you can go look at it in chapter 4, verse 8. Think about the good things. Well, that's what man will ultimately look upon his own creations and will to preserve only what is good, just as God himself looked upon what he created and knew that it was good. Paragraph 110. At this point, the will can begin to look with love on its own creations because of their great worthiness. The mind will inevitably disown its miscreations, which without the mind's belief will no longer exist. The term last judgment is frightening, not only because it has been falsely projected onto God, but also because of the association of last with death. This is an outstanding example of upside-down perception. Actually, if the meaning of the last judgment is objectively examined, it is quite apparent that it is really the doorway to life. The doorway to life, the last judgment, is objectively examined. It is quite apparent that it is really the doorway to life. Actually, if the meaning of the last judgment is objectively examined, it is quite apparent that it is really the doorway to life. No one who lives in fear is really alive. His own last judgment cannot be directed toward himself because he is not his own creation. He can, however, apply it meaningfully and at any time to everything he has created and retain in his memory only what is good. And that sure goes along good with that Philippians 4:8 passage. He can, however, apply it meaningfully and at any time to everything he has created and retain in his memory only what is good. This is what his right-mindedness cannot but dictate. The purpose of time is solely to give him time to achieve this judgment. Wow, he gives us the purpose of time. The purpose of time is solely to give man the ability to achieve this judgment, to give him time. It is his own perfect judgment of his own creations. When everything he retains is lovable, there is no reason for fear to remain with him. This is his part in the atonement. Okay, let us go back and take a look in our lesson today, lesson 16, and just a recap so that you know what to do. I have no neutral thoughts. We're going to try to look under the rocks and find the thoughts that are hiding in our minds. And we're going to tell each thought. Don't really judge it, just look at it and then say, this thought about blank is not a neutral thought. In applying the idea for today, search your mind for a minute or so with eyes closed and actively seek not to overlook any, in quotes, little thoughts which intend to elude the search. This is quite difficult until you get used to it. We're doing some we're starting in our deep mind searching, and it's going to be difficult until you get used to it. It'll become the most natural thing in all the world, though. You will find that it is still hard for you not to make artificial distinctions. Every thought that occurs to you, regardless of the quality which you assign to it, is a suitable subject for applying today's idea. In the practice periods, first repeat the idea, and then as each one crosses your mind, hold it in awareness while you tell yourself, this thought about blank is not a neutral thought, and that thought about blank is not a neutral thought. As usual, use today's idea whenever you are aware of a particular thought which arouses uneasiness. The following form is suggested for this purpose. In that you could, so you're going to do 3 or 4 during the day, but during the day, if you find a thought that makes you feel uneasy, well then apply the idea and say, this thought about blank is not a neutral thought because I have no neutral thoughts. 4 or 5 practice periods, I said 3 or 4. 4 or 5 practice periods are recommended if you find them relatively effortless. So do the 4 or 5. If strain is experienced, 3 will be enough. The length of the exercise period should also be reduced if there is discomfort. He doesn't want us to feel coerced or feel like we're going into something uncomfortable. They're very, very important in this, that we do this in such a way that we don't feel coerced or uneasy in any way. Let me get this. You know what? I've already done this recording once today in the house because it was a little chilly, and I thought, well, I'll just stay in by the fire. And it was so hot, I had my fire so hot that my phone overheated. So I came outside to cool off. I have no neutral thoughts. My hands are a little chilly, but I think I can do it just fine. I have no neutral thoughts. I have no neutral thoughts. This thought about, you fill in the blank, is not a neutral thought. That thought about is not a neutral thought. This thought about is not a neutral thought. Look at your mind. That thought about is not a neutral thought. This thought about, you fill in the blank, is not a neutral thought. That thought about is not a neutral thought. This thought about is not a neutral thought. I have no neutral thoughts. We're engaged, either going forward or in reverse. Let's be going in forward in our little metaphor, that we're engaged in God's creation. We're going to speed things up by addressing fear thoughts and letting them go and replace them with forgiveness or the atonement, salvation, the vision of Christ. Till tomorrow, do your 4 or 5 times today. Tell yourself, this thought about blank is not a neutral thought, because I have no neutral thoughts. I have no neutral thoughts.